Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Madden Fantasy Football Draft Rankings, or whatever the hell you want to call them. Today, we're going to be taking a look at rounds 21 to 19. So, without further ado, let's kick things off at the round with the round 21. In last place at number 12, we had MILF taking Marcus Davenport, defensive end. This was an absolute bust. He only scored 25 points on the season. And to be fair, in the games he played, he did well, but he just couldn't stay healthy at all. Only played 2 games the entire season, causing this to be a horrible pick. Number 11 on this list, I had Big Yawners. This was close between a couple of these players, but Big Yawners took Jimmy Garoppolo at quarterback. The quarterbacks taken in this round mostly sucked. There was one banger we'll talk about in a few minutes here, but first of all, we'll talk about Jimmy Garoppolo, the shit stain himself, with a total of 85 fantasy points on the season. Had one game on the season with over 20 points. Other than that, he just played like shit the whole time. He was just a horrible pick. He's a horrible player. Fuck Jimmy Garoppolo. Absolute bust for Big Yawners. At the number 10 spot, we had J-Bay taking Kenneth Gainwell, running back for the Philadelphia Eagles. With Kenneth Gainwell, he slightly scored more than Jimmy Garoppolo did for Big Yawners as a running back. So if that's not telling, I don't know what is. His main thing is he did play all year, but he only got a couple points, so he was subpar in pretty much all of his games. Um, at least he was able to score fantasy points against opponents, I guess you can say. It's still definitely a bust. It's not a good pick by any means, but at least he can do something, which is why he's above the other two I put on there. At the number 9 spot, Toxic Zenpai taking Chase Young is going to be a bust at the defensive end position. With Chase Young, again, just like Marcus Davenport, he couldn't stay healthy. The games he did play, a lot of the times he just showed a lot of inconsistency, sometimes scoring as little as 2 points. Multiple times he did that actually. He actually had a game with 0 points. And Chase Young was all over the place. He had a couple games that were good, mostly in the first quarter of the season, but other than that, it was just a bad pick overall. He ended up being a bad player for fantasy all year. At the number 8 spot, I had myself taking Kenny Pickett. This is an absolute bust. I don't know what universe I ever should have done this. I surely regret it. I honestly wish I would have just spent my pick on a fucking grilled cheese or something like that, because it probably would have been more useful. And I'm not just saying this as a guy who took Kenny Pickett. I'm also saying this as a guy who had to watch Kenny Pickett for a couple years. Look at this. Yahoo won't even load his bitch ass. 122 points, slightly better than Jimmy Garoppolo, despite the fact he played like 7 more games. If your quarterback is scoring a net average of 6 fantasy points a game, you know there's a problem. And that's exactly what he did after week 3. The first 3 weeks weren't complete horrible. At least he scored over 10 points in each week. After that, it was just a shit show, to say the least. And then he got fucking benched for Mason Rudolph. Yeah, overall, just a complete bust. At the number 7 position, I had PMC Wagner taking Mac Jones, who was a slight improvement over Kenny Pickett, bitch ass. Um, he had a longer stretch, not a longer stretch, but a better stretch of games where he scored decent amount of points. He had the one game where he scored negative, in the week before that where he scored two. Those were horrible. But at least for the most part, he had games where he could actually score fantasy points, which is something I can't say for Kenny Pickett. So I gave him the slight edge, but it's still a bust. That's 3 busts in a row for quarterbacks in this round. At the number 6 spot, I had Scrambled and Wiggle Waggle taking Tyler Algier. I actually gave this a meh. Um, I thought about giving it a bust, but 138 points for a running back this late in the draft, who actually was able to go out there and have himself a few good games throughout the course of the season. I think this is significantly better than quite a few other running backs that were taken later on. I don't think this is a good pick by any means, but at least he has upside that's arguable in quite a few of these games, and a lot of the times you were able to predict it, like the earlier games with Bijan Robinson, for example, not getting as many snap counts, the later games in the season with Bijan not getting as many. And this ended up not being the worst pick in the world, and at least it could be usable. So I gave it a meh, getting close to bust. Um, then at the number 5 spot, I had Dictatorship taking Tyler Higbee. This is going to be yet another meh at the tight end position here. If it will load. Tyler Higbee, from the top of my head, I think he had over 110 fantasy points, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 112 and a half. He did okay all season for the most part. He had a couple bad games, but for the most part, he did okay. Um, which obviously is bad. So I'd say this is about as meh as you can get. He had some downside. He didn't really have too much upside, with the exception of week 12. But he did have around 10 points in a lot of his games. So this is definitely a worthy meh pick. Um, then at the number 4 spot, I'm going to have Booty Basher taking Samson Ebukam at the defensive end position. This was a hit. This is a really good pick by Booty Basher. That entire Colts D line just popped off pretty much this year and have been for the past couple years. And Samson Ebukam was absolutely no exception. If it'll load, that is, because Yahoo's kind of taking a shit today, apparently. But if it loads, Samson Ebukam, or whatever the hell his name is, um, I can't even get the fucking thing to load. I hate you, Yahoo. You're poopy. But anyway, Samson Ebukam, I believe off the top of my head, scored around 160 fantasy points, if I'm correctly thinking of it. He had a lot of good games though. He had quite a few games with a lot of upside. And overall, he was a very good player. I guess you guys will just have to take my word for it. At the number 3 spot, I had Pussy taking Matthew Stafford. This was an absolute hit. With Matthew Stafford scoring 302 fantasy points, one of the better quarterbacks we've seen taken so far. I'd say second only to Jordan Love and Baker Mayfield off the top of my head of the quarterbacks we've seen taken so far. Matthew Stafford, though, in the games he played, did very well. He also missed a game, so that's kind of affecting his average slightly in the negative. But overall, he did very good for the majority of the games this season. He had a bit of a difficult stretch against some of those tougher defenses, but he still did very good this season, though. At the number 2 spot, I had Mr. Steeler Girl taking Micah Parsons, the defensive end edge rusher for the Cowboys. And Micah Parsons, if there was any doubt about Samson Ebukam being a hit, there is no doubt here with Micah Parsons having 225 points himself. Fantastic showing for defensive ends, or defensive lines in general. I think this is a good chance for, I think this is a good chance that he was one of the highest scoring defensive ends in all of fantasy football this season. He had a game where he had 0. That kind of sucked. He had a game where he had 3 and 2. So he had drawbacks, but the sheer upside he showed every single week was just kind of unreal, where he could score up to 25. He could get in his 20s, 30s, depending on the game. Overall, another fantastic season for him, and this was a definite hit here. At the number 1 spot, I had Karen's husband taking Nico Collins. Nobody going into the season expected Nico Collins to have nearly as good of a year. Maybe people could have thought, okay, maybe he'll get an upgrade or something like that. But at the end of the day, it's the Texans. He's not going to do too much crazy shit, right? And then Nico Collins proceeds to put up higher numbers than Stephon Diggs, if I'm not mistaken, off the top of my head. But unfortunately, Yahoo just doesn't want us to see certain players, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to show you. I'll kind of play out what his points were throughout the course of the season. 45 points, 45 points, 3 points, 45 points, 45 points, 45 points, 3 points. Oh, there we go. So yeah, 14, 31, 30, you got 31.6, 5.4, 46. He was great this season. For the most part, he usually scored over 10 points. Sometimes he scored in the 30s, sometimes he scored in the 40s. And overall, he was a fantastic pick. And this is also with him missing a game, or actually, I think he missed 2 games. Even with him missing 2 games this season, he still scored 282 points and was one of the best receivers in fantasy football. So overall, that was a fantastic pick for Karen. Moving on to round 20, at the number 12 position, I had Booty Basher taking Charles Harris, defensive end for the Lions. And this guy, I don't think he scored any more than 20 points off the top of my head, if I'm not mistaken. I think he only scored 3 points, actually, come to think of it. But if it will load, because Yahoo right now is just taking a shit. Oh no, it was 35 points, my mistake. So he's slightly better than I thought, but even then, maybe that's what I was looking at. Besides week 4, besides week 3, he only had 16.5 points, but every other week he only had like 2 points to 5 points. Overall, a shit pick. To say the absolute least, what a shitty pick right there. Booty Basher had, you silly, haha. MILF at the number 11 position in a similar boat took Lawrence Guy. I'll never forget in the start bench recommendations recommending that he benched Lawrence Guy's Caillou looking ass over and over again. He just never did it. I guess he really liked Lawrence Guy. He was the guy, I guess. Scoring a net 58 fantasy points all season. Didn't score 10 points at all in any game this season. Just a horrible, horrible pick right there. At the defensive end position, he just really struggled. And yeah, all I can say is he did slightly better than Charles Harris. That's his only upside. 2 busts so far. Then PMC Wagner comes in with another bust with Dawson Knox at the tight end position. This was a surprising bust. I don't think even with Dalton Kincaid, everybody expected Dawson Knox just to get thrown on the back burner that much. Not like yet anyway, until he got traded to another team. But Dawson Knox got pretty much benched after week 7. And even when he was playing, he really didn't do much outside of week 2. So only 54 points, and I can't call this anything but a bust. Then at the number 9 spot, we had Mr. Steeler Girl taking CJ Gardner-Johnson. He showed upside whenever he was healthy, but unfortunately, if you own CJ Gardner-Johnson, so in this case, Mr. Steeler Girl, he got hurt very, very early into the season. I want to say by week 3. Yeah, he got hurt. He showed a lot of upside in the 2 games he played, though. 12 and 15, solid games right there, but he just couldn't stay healthy. But at least he had use for those 2 games, so I put him over the other guys. At the number 8 position, I had Karen's husband taking Samaje Perine, running back for Denver. And he scored 116 points. This is going to be yet another bust, but he scored 116 points for these Broncos. He had a couple games with some good upside, like 13, 11-point weeks, 11 week 1 for the Raiders. But for the most part, at the end of the day, he was still a backup running back to Javonte Williams. I don't think you were expecting too much unless Javonte Williams got hurt again here. And overall, he had a couple games where he had his use, but that's about as far as I can go when it comes to Samaje Perine. It's still a bust, but it's significantly better than the other guys that were taken so far. At the number 7 spot, you had Rictatorship taking the Green Bay Packers version of Samaje Perine and A.J. Dillon. And A.J. Dillon did slightly better and actually looked like he was having quite a few good games throughout the course of the season. The problem is he just kind of fell off the planet of the earth during some of the games. Like, he had a couple of weeks where he had 1 point, 3 points, 5 points. He had quite a few games with 2 points, 5 points, a couple with 7. So overall, he was usable. Part of me wants to move him up to a hit tier or to a mid tier, but overall, I'm still going to call this a bust just because of how inconsistent he was and how many games he just played like shit. But he did have his upside, so he's significantly better than everybody else. Then I picked Cole Holcomb at linebacker. This was another bust. A lot of busts in this round so far. And when he played, he was a very good linebacker for the most part outside of weeks 1 and 4 where he was kind of mid. But he got hurt against Tennessee, and his season was over after that. I don't even know for sure if he's ever going to play football again. But nonetheless, he did good while he was playing. But unfortunately, it's still a bust because he got hurt so early in the season. At the number 5 spot, I had Scrambled Wiggle Waggle taking Jadeveon Clowney at the defensive end spot. This was meh. Jadeveon Clowney, I believe he scored about 160-some fantasy points throughout the course of the season. If it'll load, I guess Yahoo just has a hatred of these defensive ends. But he had about 160 points, and the main reason I put him at meh, off the top of my head, is because 150, is because he's just very inconsistent. 3 of the last 4 games of the season, he scored 4 or less. He was hurt for the week 13. He had a few good weeks before that where he had 23, 10, 15. And overall, he had a lot of very bad games, but he did have a couple good games. So I was willing to push him slightly into the meh, leaning towards bad, though, or leaning towards bust. But Scrambled still gets the 5th spot with how bad this round has been, and it's still going to get a meh. Then at the number 4 spot, J-Bay is going to get another meh with Elijah Moore at the wide receiver spot, scoring 133 points. Elijah Moore got another meh in a similar boat to Jadeveon Clowney, where he would get about 7 to 10 points in most games. And I picked him over guys like Jadeveon Clowney just for his consistency. It's still on the lower side of meh, closer to bust, but I would still say he at least served his purpose and could have been startable in a lot of those games. So at least he would have been useful throughout the course of the season, unlike a lot of these other guys. and at least he was somewhat consistent at it. Then at the number 3 spot, I had Big Yawners taking Sam Hubbard. As much as I wanted to call this a hit, I had to call it a meh. With Sam Hubbard, I was surprised to figure out he only scored 150 fantasy points this season. I really thought he would have scored a lot more, um, but he really didn't. I believe he actually was dealing with an injury, if I'm not mistaken, off the top of my head. Um, if it'll load, there we go. 150 points exactly. He missed 3 games in the middle course of the season, and then he also kind of had a struggle for the 3 of the last 4 weeks of the season as well, which really, really held him back. For the most part, when he played, he did very well, though. I'm going to call this guy on the upper half of meh. If it weren't for the injuries and it weren't for that final 3 quarters of the or final 3 out of 4 games of the season, he probably would have been a definite hit. But I'm going to lean towards meh just because of how he kind of fell off week 9 and after. After week 9, you can kind of see only getting 11 points is his best game in another 8 weeks is kind of bad. Then at the number 2 spot, I had Toxic Zenpai taking Cameron Curl at the safety position. This was a hit. This is our first hit of this round, surprisingly enough. And Cameron Curl, just like he did the year prior, went out there and was actually one of the better safeties you could use in fantasy football. 213 points this season. Had a very, very, very strong start to the season, getting 20 points in multiple games, getting around 11 to 13 on his lower games. He had a bad game week 7, but he went back to business right after that, 16, 10, 17, 11. And after that, his lowest amount of points was 8 points, which is a little bit subpar, but it's not horrible. And overall, he had a very, very good season, to say the absolute least, and this was a very good hit for Toxic. At the number 1 spot for this round, I had Pussy taking Rashee Rice. Let's just hope he doesn't try to Rashee Rice someone, because that could probably end bad. But he had slightly more points than Cameron Curl. And this is with him having a very, very slow start to the season. And not even that slow, to be honest. He still had around 13 points per game for the most part at the early point of the season. But we're not even looking at Rashee Rice for that. We're looking at him for the end of the season where he was putting up around 14 to 20 points like it was clockwork every week. For the playoff stretch for Rashee Rice, this was a fantastic performance. And if you're Pussy, I would say Rashee Rice was definitely the best pick of this round. This is a very good find for the Chiefs. And yeah, he ended up having a very, very solid year. And that's the number 1 pick for round 20. Now we'll move on to round 19. So with round 19 at the number 12 spot, I chose Karen's husband taking Tank McKinley, defensive end, who I don't think actually scored a single point. Or no, I'm sorry, it's not Tank McKinley. It's Kenny Willakes. I don't fucking know. He had no points. I don't even know if he was on a starting roster. So yeah, that's a bust. He didn't even get any points. At the number 11 spot, I had J-Bay taking, I believe it's Justin. I don't even know how to fuck to pronounce some of these names. Or no, I'm sorry. Hang on 1 second. I'm actually looking at the wrong round because I'm retarded. But at the number 11 spot, I actually had Rick Tatership. I cannot talk right now. I'm losing my shit. At the number 11 spot, we had Rick Tatership taking Caleb Murphy, the defensive end, who scored a whole 3 points. So, he's not last because those 2 final weeks of the season, he had 2 points and 1 point. There you go. At the number 10 spot, you had J-Bay taking Sam Kamara, defensive end. This is yet another bust. All these have been busts if they're not obvious. Sam Kamara, if this thing will load in the slightest, would be great. I think he had like 20 fantasy points if you're being generous. 14. Yeah, apparently he scored fantasy points, even though Yahoo says he didn't actually do that. But I don't know. Somebody's lying here. Either his fantasy points at the top left or his fantasy points in the actual games. Either way, I'll credit J-Bay something. He needs something to make it slightly higher on his list. But either way, this is a bust. At the number 9 spot, I had MILF taking Quentin Jefferson. I believe Quentin Jefferson actually played for a team. He just didn't do good. Only 91 fantasy points on the season, but at least he did some stuff. Still another bust. At the number 8 spot, I had Scrambled Wiggle Waggle taking Chikosium Okonkwo. This is going to be another bust at tight end. I want to say he scored 90 to 100 fantasy points, 114. Um, and he had some game where he showed upside, but for the most part, this was still a bust pick throughout the course of the season, getting games where he scored as low as 0 to 1 point. Um, at the number 7 spot, I had Mr. Steeler Girl taking Chris Jones, the defensive tackle for Kansas City. Fantastic player in real life, but unfortunately just didn't really put up many stats this season. Um, for the most part, with Mr. Steeler Girl here, but I'm going to call this a bust. I would say this is on the upper end of bust, getting into meh, but it's still a bust nonetheless for Chris Jones, who spent a lot of games this season really just not doing much. He had a strong start to the season, had a game against the Eagles where he did fantastic, had a good later stretch, but when you're spending 4 games of the season scoring 0 points, I just can't justify that. Plus, he had 2 games of 3-1. And overall, when half your season is just a shit show, I can't put you any higher than a bust. Um, at the number 6 spot, I had PMC Wagner taking another defensive tackle, Quinnen Williams. I was actually surprised about this, but I was going to call him a meh. This is probably on the high side of meh, getting closer to a hit. With Quinnen Williams, he scored 174 fantasy points, which is a respectable number, but again, his consistency was all over the place this season, going games with 3, 2, 4, multiple times this season. He did have some good upside, though, but I'm just going to call it a meh just because of how many games he struggled in. At the number 5 spot, or no, I'm sorry. Yeah, the number 5 spot, we had David Long, linebacker of Toxic Zenpai, getting 212 fantasy points on the season. And this is another meh pick. When he actually played and started, he did very well, scoring upwards of around 20 points per game as a linebacker. He did very good in those games where he actually started, but for the most part, this season he had a lot of bad games as well, with 2, 7, 8, 7, 4, multiple times. And overall, I'm going to call this on the upper side of meh as well. I just placed him a little bit higher than Quinnen Williams just because he did have a bit more points and a bit more consistency for the most part. At the number 4 spot, I had myself taking Rayshawn Jenkins, safety for the Jaguars at the time. I believe he's now in Seattle. But this was definitely a hit at the safety position, though. And the 4th best pick of this round, if it will ever load, because we actually had a few safeties on deck here that were really good picks. Rayshawn Jenkins with 212 points in the season had a very good season with the exception of week 4 and with the exception of week 8 and 17. Now with week 17 he kind of got hurt mid-game, but we'll kind of ignore that. But anyway, for the most part this season he had over 10 points in almost every single game, with a few games getting in the 20s. And overall just a very good pick, getting into his 200s for the fantasy points. And this is definitely a hit. At the number 3 spot, I had Big Yawners taking Kyle Hamilton, who outproduced the safety I just mentioned by about 15 points. He was a little bit more on the boomer bust side, having one really bad game with 1 point. But for the most part, his upside was ridiculous, scoring upwards of 39 points in a fantasy game, 29. He had quite a few games in the 20s. So I figured I'd rank him just a little bit higher than Rayshawn Jenkins. Unfortunately, he was very boomer bust, though, which stopped me from putting him any higher on the list. At the number 2 spot, I had Booty Basher taking, I believe he took Julian Love for Seattle. And this was a fantastic safety. I believe he was one of the highest scoring safeties in all of fantasy football. This is a player where if he was in a different round, he probably would have been the number 1. But unfortunately, there was one guy taken that was a little bit better, in my opinion. But with Julian Love, he was no slouch, having a lot of games with almost, not a lot of games, but the vast majority of his games over 10 points, and even the games that didn't go to 10 points, he had at least 7. But a lot of games went into the 20s, though. This was a fantastic player with 246 fantasy points, one of the best safeties in fantasy football this season. And this was definitely a hit for Booty. At the number 1 spot, you had Pussy taking Alex Singleton at the linebacker position. Pussy goes back-to-back and gets the number 1 pick for these middle rounds here. And you have Alex Singleton, the linebacker for Denver. Going into the season, I don't think a lot of a lot of people expected him to do that great because he had Josie Jewell in there taking a lot of his tackles. He basically went in there and earned his starting job back, which is pretty rare in the NFL, but he went out there and earned his starting job back away from Josie Jewell. And he proceeded to get quite a few games where he scored at least 15 to 30 almost every time. He had 2 actual bad games this season with 7 and 8, which even then isn't horrible. But the sheer amount of upside he showed throughout the course of the season was just fantastic, and was a lot of the reason why Rick Tatership ended up winning the championship, I'd say, because he was the guy that actually ended up with Alex Singleton later on in the season. But the guy who drafted him, Pussy, this is definitely going to get credited towards him because he's the one who found him and drafted him with 320 points. That's the best pick of round 19. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you guys later with the part 4 where it's going to be the next 3 rounds. Either way, I'll catch you guys later.